Her laughter echoed in my ears, sharp and unkind. As I stood there holding the envelope, I wasn't supposed to find it, that much was clear. Her name was scribbled across the front in her sister's handwriting. But it was the bulge inside that stopped me cold. My hand trembled as I slid the contents free, and there it was, a signed affidavit. It was my name at the top. My name, and beneath it, a laundry list of accusations so vile, so calculated, it felt like someone had punched me in the chest. Abusive behavior, it read. Emotional manipulation. Financial control. The lies poured off the page, each one worse than the last. And there, at the bottom, was Jessica's perfect, practiced signature, alongside Laura's as a witness. I looked up from the paper to see her standing in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. She wasn't startled. She wasn't ashamed. If anything, she looked bored. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," she said, her voice as smooth as glass. My throat tightened, rage and disbelief swirling together in a storm I could barely contain. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, shaking the paper at her. She smirked, tilting her head like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "What does it look like?" "Insurance." She crossed the room slowly, deliberately, her heels clicking against the floor. "Divorce is a game, darling, and I play to win." Her calmness was what broke me. I slammed the paper down on the counter, my chest heaving. "You think this is a joke?" My voice was louder than I intended, but I didn't care. This is what you've been plotting with Laura? Lying to lawyers, inventing stories to ruin me?" Jessica shrugged, brushing an invisible speck off her blouse. "Don't be so dramatic. It's not lying, it's strategy. Nobody cares about the truth in court, honey. They care about who looks like the victim. And between us," she gestured toward herself with a small, cruel smile, "I've always been better at wearing that mask." For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The person in front of me wasn't the woman I'd married. She wasn't even someone I recognized. I stared at her, trying to find a hint of the person I used to love, but all I saw was cold calculation. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And this is what you do? You destroy it. Destroy me." Her smile faded then, replaced by a look I'd never seen before. Contempt. "Oh, please, save the sob story. You'll be fine. Men like you always land on their feet." She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But I promise you, by the time this is over, you'll wish you hadn't." It wasn't the words themselves that sent the chill through me. It was the certainty in her tone, like she'd already won. Like the game was over and I was the last one to realize it. But Jessica didn't know everything. She didn't know what I'd overheard last week when Laura got too drunk at that bar and started running her mouth. She didn't know about the phone call I'd recorded, where they laid out every ugly detail of their plan. She didn't know I'd been quietly building my own case, piece by piece, waiting for the moment to strike. So, I stood there, looking at her, this stranger who had once been my wife, and I let her think she'd won. Let her bask in her arrogance, her misplaced confidence. Because when the time came, I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to annihilate her. Jessica thought she had me in checkmate. She strutted around the house with an air of invincibility, like a queen on a chessboard that no one dared challenge. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't playing her game anymore. I'd spent the past week unraveling her web, and the more I pulled, the more I discovered just how deep her betrayal went. The affidavit was only the tip of the iceberg. There were hidden accounts in her name, transactions flagged under Laura's business, and phone records linking them to meetings with divorce attorneys. Months before I even suspected something was wrong, they were laying the groundwork for a scorched earth campaign, designed to leave me with nothing. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. Started with the phone. After that night, I didn't confront her again. Instead, I backed up every shred of evidence I could find. Screenshots, voice recordings, even emails Jessica had carelessly left open on her laptop. But the real bombshell came when I got access to our home security system. Jessica and Laura were careful, but not careful enough. They'd used my house, as their war room, strategizing while I was at work, thinking the cameras in the living room were just for show. I spent hours reviewing the footage, and the things I heard made my blood boil. "I'm telling you, he won't fight back," Jessica said in one clip. sitting cross-legged on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. He's too soft. Always has been. I'll cry in court if I have to, and the judge will eat it up. Laura laughed, twirling a pen between her fingers. Men like him are predictable. You play the victim, flash some tears, and they fold. By the time we're done, he won't have a penny to his name. They toasted to their plan, laughing like villains in some cheap drama. It was almost surreal. The woman I'd shared my life with, plotting to destroy me with her sister like it was just another casual conversation. I didn't sleep that night, but it wasn't because of the betrayal, it was because of the opportunity. They thought they had all the cards, but they'd handed me the ace without realizing it. That footage was my weapon, and I was going to use it to tear their scheme apart piece by piece. The next day, I called my lawyer, James. He wasn't the kind of guy you saw on billboards or flashy commercials. He was quiet, meticulous, and relentless. Exactly what I needed. When I showed him the footage and laid out everything I'd found, he leaned back in his chair, whistling softly. "This isn't just a defense," he said. "This is a nuclear bomb. You sit tight, and let me handle the rest." Jessica, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had changed. She'd flash me those fake smiles at dinner, make snide little comments about my fragile ego, and text Laura under the table, thinking she was so clever. Every little jab only fueled me more. The real turning point came a few days later. Jessica came home late, her hair slightly tousled, a smug grin plastered across her face. She poured herself a drink and sat down across from me at the dining table. "You look tired," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Long day at work?" I met her gaze, calm and steady. "Not as long as yours, I'm sure." Her grin faltered for a split second. She didn't respond, just sipped her drink, eyeing me over the rim of her glass. She thought she had everything under control, that I was still the clueless husband she could manipulate at will. But she had no idea what was coming. The wheels were already in motion. The lawyer, the evidence, the plan. And when it all came crashing down on her, she wouldn't see it coming. Neither would Laura. The day of the deposition was set. Jessica, still smug in her belief that she was untouchable, treated it like a casual errand. She even joked about it the night before over dinner, saying, "Don't take it too hard tomorrow, babe, it's just business." Her tone was condescending, like she was speaking to someone beneath her. I played along, offering her a tight smile, pretending her barbs didn't land. The truth was, I'd spent the last week preparing with James, tightening every screw in our case. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. The morning of, Jessica wore a sharp blazer, her makeup impeccable, radiating confidence as she walked into the law office. Laura trailed behind her, carrying a stack of papers meant to intimidate. The sisters exchanged a look of satisfaction as they sat across the conference table from me, their lawyer already flipping through his notes. "Let's get this started," Jessica's lawyer said, smirking as if the outcome was already a foregone conclusion. He leaned forward, exuding that fake charm lawyers like him love to use, and started with what I could only describe as a performance. "Jessica has been nothing but patient and understanding during this process," he began. "She has no desire for conflict but feels compelled to protect herself given the circumstances." I nearly laughed out loud at that. Protect herself? From what? From the consequences of her own lies. But I kept my composure, silently meeting Jessica's gaze. She looked back at me with that same icy smirk, as if daring me to speak. James, sitting beside me, cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I'd like to submit some additional evidence into the record," he said, his voice calm but firm. Jessica's lawyer looked annoyed. "Is this going to delay us? We have a clear agenda today." "Oh, it won't delay anything," James interrupted smoothly. "In fact, it'll clarify things quite a bit." He slid a USB drive across the table. Jessica's lawyer hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with her. She looked momentarily confused but quickly masked it with indifference. Laura shifted in her seat, her confident facade starting to falter. "What is this?" their lawyer asked, narrowing his eyes. James leaned back, giving him a pointed smile. "Go ahead, play it." The room fell silent as the lawyer plugged the drive into his laptop. A video file opened, and the first image was unmistakable. Jessica and Laura sitting in my living room, a bottle of wine between them. The audio played loud and clear, filling the room with their voices. "I'll cry if I have to," Jessica's voice rang out. "You know how good I am at that. He'll crumble like he always does. Men like him are so predictable." Laura laughed. "And the best part is we'll split everything. He won't even know what hit him." Jessica's lawyer paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Across the table, Laura's face turned a deep shade of red, and Jessica? For the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely shocked. Her mask slipped, and the panic underneath was unmistakable. This is a violation of privacy," her lawyer sputtered, slamming the laptop shut. James didn't miss a beat. "The footage was recorded in my client's home, on a system they both knew existed. There's no violation here. If anything, this evidence speaks directly to the validity, or lack thereof, of your client's claims." Jessica turned to me, her eyes narrowing, the anger bubbling to the surface. "You sneaky bastard," she hissed under her breath. I didn't respond. I just leaned back in my chair, letting her stew in her own humiliation. The deposition ended early, with Jessica's lawyer requesting a recess to review new evidence. But the damage was done. I walked out of that office with a calm I hadn't felt in months, knowing the sisters were now scrambling, their perfect little plan crumbling in real time. And this was just the beginning. That night, the house was silent. Jessica didn't speak a word to me when she walked in, slamming the door behind her. I was in the living room, casually flipping through a book, pretending not to notice the storm brewing just a few feet away. She dropped her bag onto the kitchen counter with a loud thud and stood there for a moment, her back to me. I could almost feel the heat of her rage from across the room. Finally, she turned. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I looked up, keeping my expression neutral. "Clever enough to stop you and Laura from destroying my life," I said evenly, closing the book and setting it aside. Her fists clenched at her sides. "That footage? That stunt you pulled today? You think that changes anything? You think you've won?" I stood, slowly, deliberately, letting the tension between us stretch. "It's not about winning, Jessica. It's about the truth. Something you've been allergic to lately." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "Truth? Don't make me laugh. This isn't about truth. This is about you being a control freak who can't handle the fact that I'm done." "Done?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "You weren't done when you were spending my money, living in my house, pretending to be a loving wife while you and your sister plotted behind my back." She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You've always been such a martyr, haven't you? Poor Eric, the victim, the husband who works so hard. Well, newsflash. Your hard work doesn't entitle you to control my life." Her words stung, but I didn't flinch. "Control your life?" I shot back. "This isn't about control, Jessica. This is about betrayal. You didn't just lie, you tried to destroy me. You and Laura thought you could rewrite reality and walk away with everything. But guess what? That's not happening." She smirked then, a twisted, venomous expression that made my skin crawl. "You think the court's going to care about your little videos? You think a judge is going to side with a man over a woman who claims she's been abused?" She threw the word out like a weapon, daring me to react. I stayed silent, my jaw tightening. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me crack. Jessica leaned in, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You're a fool if you think this ends here. Laura's already talking to someone about getting that footage thrown out. And when it's gone, what do you have left? Nothing. Just a pathetic little man trying to hold onto something he already lost." I met her glare, the fury in me building like a firestorm. But I forced myself to stay calm, because she didn't know. She didn't know about the financial records I'd uncovered, the discrepancies that linked her to fraudulent activity. She didn't know about the witness James had tracked down, an old friend of Laura's who wasn't too thrilled about being cheated out of her cut of their schemes. Jessica thought she still had the upper hand, but she was wrong. So, I simply smiled, a cold, quiet smile that made her falter for just a second. "Go ahead, Jessica," I said, my voice low but steady. "Fight me. Throw everything you've got. But remember this. The harder you push, the harder you'll fall. And when you do, don't expect me to catch you." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might lunge at me. But she didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed upstairs, her footsteps pounding like gunshots against the silence. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, staring at the empty space she left behind. The house felt colder now, emptier, as if her venom had seeped into the walls. But beneath the ache, there was something else, a quiet resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Jessica was gone before I even woke up. She'd left her coffee cup on the counter, lipstick smeared on the rim, like she hadn't even cared to clean up. It was her silent way of saying, "I don't need you. Fine by me." The quieter she was, the more space I had to maneuver. By midday, James called. His voice was calm, measured, but there was a subtle edge of excitement I hadn't heard before. "Eric, we've got them." I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" "The financial records," he said. "We pulled a deep dive into Laura's business accounts. Turns out, Jessica's been funneling money into one of Laura's LLCs for months. It's blatant fraud, and with the divorce proceedings underway, it's going to blow up in their faces." I couldn't suppress a grim smile. "How solid is it?" "Rock solid," James said. "We have everything: bank statements, wire transfers, even emails discussing how they'd move the money to make it look legitimate. It's textbook embezzlement." The pieces were falling into place faster than I'd hoped. I thanked James and hung up, the weight on my chest easing slightly. But I knew this was just one battle in a larger war. Jessica wouldn't back down easily, and neither would Laura. They were too arrogant, too convinced of their own brilliance. That evening, Jessica came home later than usual. She walked in wearing a fresh manicure, her heels clicking against the tile as she tossed her purse onto the counter. "Big day at work?" I asked casually, glancing up from the paperwork I was reviewing. She didn't answer, just poured herself a glass of wine and stared out the window like I wasn't even there. The tension in the room was suffocating, but I let it linger. She wanted to play silent, fine. It only gave me more time to study her. Finally, she turned, her eyes narrowing. "What's your endgame, Eric?" she asked, her voice sharp but calm, like she was trying to feel me out. I leaned back, pretending to think. "Endgame? I'm just trying to get through this divorce without being completely screwed over." She smirked, swirling her wine. "You're so predictable. You think a few videos and some paperwork are going to save you? You're just delaying the inevitable." I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "Maybe, or maybe I'm smarter than you think." Her smirk faltered, just for a moment. "You're not as clever as you think you are," she shot back. "And Laura's already 5 steps ahead of whatever little plan you've cooked up." I nodded slowly, pretending to absorb her words. But inside, I was grinning. Let her think Laura was the mastermind. Let her think I was scrambling. She didn't know that James had already filed a motion to introduce the financial evidence into the case. She didn't know that the affidavit Laura had notarized implicated her just as much as Jessica. They were both trapped, and neither of them even realized it yet. As she turned and walked out of the room, I picked up my phone and sent James a simple text. "Proceed with the next step." Jessica and Laura thought they were playing chess. But I wasn't playing their game anymore. I was rewriting the rules, and when the board finally flipped, they wouldn't just lose, they'd never recover. The first sign of cracks in their plan came 2 days later. Jessica had been unusually quiet, spending most of her time on the phone with Laura or pacing the house like a restless predator. She didn't know it, but her anxiety was confirmation that James's latest move had hit its mark. It started with the court filing. James had submitted a formal request for a financial investigation into Laura's LLCs, citing evidence of fraud tied directly to Jessica's accounts. The filing wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a bombshell. It forced their lawyer to scramble, and for Jessica and Laura, who had always relied on being one step ahead, the tables were starting to turn. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Jessica walked in, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She looked rattled, her usual mask of control slipping just enough for me to notice. "We need to talk," she said abruptly. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch. Finally, I turned, mug in hand, and gestured for her to continue. "I'm listening." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window like she was searching for the right angle. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this little stunt of yours is going to backfire. Laura already has a plan to counter this." "Does she?" I said, raising an eyebrow. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the two of you are scrambling. Her jaw tightened. Scrambling? Please. You're the one who's desperate. Dragging out this mess, wasting time and money on lawyers. It's pathetic. I sipped my coffee, keeping my expression neutral. If that's what you think, why are you so nervous? She flinched just barely, but it was enough. I'm not nervous, she snapped. I just think you're making this harder on yourself. We could have settled this quietly, but now you've turned it into a circus. A circus? I set my mug down, leaning against the counter. Jessica, the only reason this isn't quiet is because you and Laura decided to play dirty. You didn't want fair. You wanted everything. Her silence was deafening. Her lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, she didn't have a snappy comeback. Here's the thing, I continued, my voice calm but firm. You're not going to win this. Not the way you think. You can drag it out, lie to the court, and try to smear my name, but the truth has a funny way of coming out. And when it does, you and your sister are going to have to answer for it. Her eyes narrowed, her hand tightening around her phone. You think you're so righteous, she hissed. But you're not as innocent as you pretend to be. Don't forget, Eric, I know you. I know everything about you. The threat was empty, but the venom in her voice wasn't. It was her last-ditch effort to rattle me, to make me second-guess myself. But I wasn't biting. Not anymore. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You used to know me, Jessica, but the man you're looking at now isn't the same one you've been playing all these months. You think you can intimidate me? Manipulate me? Not anymore. She stared at me, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. But she didn't say another word. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. As soon as I heard the car engine roar to life and fade down the driveway, I pulled out my phone and called James. She's feeling the heat, I said, keeping my voice low. Let's move to the next phase. James's response was simple. It's already underway. By the time Jessica and Laura realized what was happening, it would be too late. The courtroom wasn't just going to be a battleground. It was going to be the scene of their undoing. The courtroom was packed. Jessica sat at the defendant's table, her polished exterior firmly intact, wearing a crisp blazer and a neutral expression that screamed, I'm untouchable. Laura was seated directly behind her, leaning slightly forward like a puppet master overseeing her creation. Their lawyer, a slick-talking shark named Maxwell, shuffled his papers with a confidence that radiated arrogance. They thought they had the upper hand, but they didn't know what was coming. I sat across from them with James by my side, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension crackling in the air. He glanced at me and gave a slight nod. The plan was in motion. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. We went through the procedural motions, introductions, opening statements, but my focus never left Jessica and Laura. I could see the subtle tells. Jessica tapping her fingers against her leg under the table, Laura's jaw tightening whenever Maxwell whispered something in her ear. They were holding it together on the surface, but barely. Then it began. James stood and presented the first piece of evidence. The footage from my home security system. As the video played, Jessica's face remained stoic, but Laura's expression cracked. The sound of their own voices filled the room, detailing their plan to manipulate the court, bleed me dry financially, and walk away with everything. Maxwell shot to his feet, sputtering objections about context and privacy, but the judge waved him off. This evidence is admissible, she said, her tone sharp. Continue. Jessica's mask didn't slip. Not entirely, but her hands clenched the edge of the table so tightly I thought she might snap it in two. When the video ended, James didn't waste a second. Your Honor, he said, this demonstrates a clear pattern of deceit and manipulation by Mrs. Gray and her sister, Laura Carter. But that's not all. He pulled out the financial records next. A hush fell over the room as he presented transaction after transaction, showing how Jessica had been funneling money into Laura's LLC. There were spreadsheets, wire transfer confirmations, and emails detailing how they planned to launder the funds to make them look legitimate. This isn't just a divorce case, James said, his voice steady but firm. This is fraud, premeditated and systematic. Maxwell tried to object again, but even he looked rattled now. Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat. her confidence visibly crumbling. Jessica, however, remained frozen, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the table. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was panicking. Then came the final blow. James called a witness to the stand. Laura's former business partner, Christine. She was calm, composed, and devastatingly precise as she detailed how Laura had cut her out of their business dealings, using Jessica's funds to prop up failing ventures and secure assets in her name. "I didn't know it at the time," Christine said, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "But they were setting up a financial safety net to use in the divorce. They planned everything. How to hide the money, how to discredit Eric, how to walk away with it all." The room buzzed with whispers. Jessica's lawyer looked like he'd swallowed a lemon, and Laura's face was ashen. Jessica finally turned to look at me, her eyes blazing with fury and something else, fear. When the judge called for a recess, Jessica stormed out of the courtroom with Laura on her heels. I followed at a distance, watching as the sisters huddled in the hallway, their animated whispers growing louder. "You said this wouldn't happen," Jessica hissed, her voice sharp and desperate. "I didn't know Christine would talk," Laura shot back. "You should have been more careful with the money." Their argument spilled over, loud enough that I could hear every word. It was like watching their empire crumble in real time, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The walls were closing in on them, and they knew it. The courtroom was just the beginning. Their carefully constructed world was about to collapse, and this time, there was no way out. Jessica and Laura didn't return to the courtroom immediately after the recess was called. Their absence stretched longer than expected, prompting curious glances and quiet whispers from the spectators. Maxwell, their lawyer, was pacing near the doors, his jaw clenched as he repeatedly checked his phone. He was unraveling just like his clients. James leaned over to me, his voice low. "They're panicking." "Good. Let them stew." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, but inside, I felt a grim satisfaction. The pieces were all in place, and now it was just a matter of time before they made their next mistake. And they would make one, it was inevitable. When they finally reappeared, Jessica's face was pale, her perfect mask cracked, revealing the simmering storm beneath. Laura followed behind her, her usual confidence replaced by a tense, robotic stiffness. Maxwell immediately pulled them aside, whispering furiously as they nodded along. Whatever they were planning, it wouldn't be enough. The session resumed, and Maxwell tried to claw back some semblance of control, lobbing weak accusations about misinterpretations and coincidences. But James was relentless, countering every argument with precision and presenting additional evidence, as if he were flipping through a playbook. And then the moment came. James rose from his seat, holding a small stack of papers. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence into the record," he said. Jessica stiffened, her knuckles white against the table. Laura whispered something frantically to Maxwell, whose face turned an alarming shade of red. "What is this now?" Maxwell demanded, his voice louder than it needed to be. He was trying to mask his unease, but it wasn't working. James handed the papers to the judge. "This is a sworn affidavit from a private investigator hired to look into the defendant's financial activities. It includes photographic evidence and witness testimony confirming that Mrs. Gray and Ms. Carter were in the process of moving additional assets overseas, hidden accounts that they failed to disclose during discovery." The room went still. Jessica's eyes widened, her breath hitching audibly. Laura's composure shattered completely. "That's not true," she blurted out, drawing the judge's sharp glare. James ignored the outburst and continued. "The investigator's report details how funds were transferred to offshore accounts, disguised as business expenses. This was done to ensure these assets would remain inaccessible during the division of property." The judge turned her gaze to Jessica. "Mrs. Gray, is this true?" Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked to Maxwell, who was frantically flipping through his notes, sweat beading on his forehead. Laura, on the other hand, couldn't stay silent. "This is ridiculous," Laura snapped, her voice rising. "You can't prove anything. This is all circumstantial." James raised an eyebrow, his expression calm and calculating. "The documents contain exact account numbers and transaction records. If you'd like, We can subpoena the foreign banks for additional confirmation. Laura's face turned ashen, and Jessica finally broke her silence. This is a witch hunt, she said, her voice trembling with anger. He's trying to humiliate me. That's all this is. James didn't flinch. No, Mrs. Gray. This is accountability. The judge, clearly unimpressed with their theatrics, silenced the room with a sharp rap of her gavel. I'll review this evidence thoroughly before making my ruling. In the meantime, I suggest both parties prepare for further questioning. The session adjourned, and the tension in the air was palpable as people began filing out. Jessica and Laura didn't wait for the crowd to clear. They bolted for the hallway, their hushed voices carrying just enough for me to catch fragments of their panic. This is a disaster, Laura hissed. I told you not to push him this far. Jessica's voice cracked as she shot back. You said he was too dumb to fight back. That we had this under control. I didn't follow them this time. I didn't need to. Their desperation was loud enough to echo through the courthouse. As I walked out, James patted me on the shoulder. You're holding up well, he said. I've had good practice, I replied, my voice steady. But inside, I felt something more profound than calm vindication. Jessica and Laura had thought they were untouchable, that they could scheme and lie their way to victory. But now, they were trapped, their empire of deceit crumbling around them. And the best part? The real twist hadn't even come yet. The courtroom was quiet when the session resumed the following day, but the tension was so thick it felt like the room might implode. Jessica's polished mask was gone, replaced with a brittle facade that cracked more with every passing moment. Laura, sitting stiffly behind her, had the look of someone who knew the walls were closing in. Maxwell, their once cocky lawyer, was visibly rattled, flipping through his notes as though he could find a lifeline hidden somewhere in the margins. James, on the other hand, was calm, composed, and utterly lethal. He leaned over to me before the judge entered. Today's the day, he said quietly. They won't recover from this. I nodded, my jaw tight. I didn't respond. I wanted to let the moment speak for itself. When the judge called the session to order, James wasted no time. He stood, his voice firm but measured, and delivered the final nail in their coffin. Your Honor, he began. The evidence we've presented so far establishes a clear pattern of deception and fraud by Mrs. Gray and Miss Carter. But there's one final piece of evidence that we believe will provide full context to their actions. Jessica stiffened in her seat, her fingers gripping the table. Laura whispered something urgently to Maxwell, but he waved her off, his frustration palpable. James walked to the center of the courtroom, holding a sealed envelope. This is a sworn statement from a former associate of Miss Carter's, Christine Harlow, who worked closely with her on several financial transactions. Laura's head snapped up at the mention of Christine's name, her face going pale. Jessica turned to her, her whisper sharp and frantic, but Laura only shook her head, clearly panicking. James continued. The statement not only corroborates the evidence of fraudulent activity, but also reveals a deliberate attempt to frame Mr. Gray as financially abusive in order to justify the manipulation of marital assets. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're saying they fabricated claims to gain leverage in the divorce? Yes, Your Honor, James said, his voice steady. Christine's statement details conversations and written correspondence in which Mrs. Gray and Miss Carter explicitly discussed creating a false narrative to present to the court. The room erupted in whispers. Jessica's face turned beet red, and Laura leaned forward, hissing something at Maxwell, who looked like he was contemplating disappearing through the floor. Order! The judge barked, silencing the room with a sharp rap of her gavel. She turned to Maxwell. Do you wish to respond? Maxwell stood, visibly flustered. Your Honor, this is a baseless attack. Christine Harlow has a known history of animosity toward my clients. She has nothing to gain by lying. James cut in smoothly. In fact, her cooperation is what brought several key financial discrepancies to light, including the hidden offshore accounts we presented yesterday. The judge gestured for Maxwell to sit. I'll hear this testimony. Jessica's head snapped toward me, her eyes blazing with rage. I didn't flinch. I simply held her gaze, calm and unyielding, as if to say, you did this to yourself. James handed the sealed envelope to the judge. As she read through the statement, the courtroom was silent. The only sound was the faint rustle of paper and the rapid tapping of Laura's heel against the floor. After what felt like an eternity, the judge looked up. Her expression was unreadable, but her words were devastating. "The statement corroborates the evidence submitted," she said. "It's clear there was a concerted effort to manipulate this court, which casts serious doubt on the credibility of Mrs. Gray and Ms. Carter." Jessica's lawyer shot up again, desperation leaking into his voice. "Your Honor, Enough!" The judge snapped, her tone final. "I've heard enough. We will reconvene tomorrow for my ruling." The gavel came down, and the room erupted into chaos. Jessica spun around to face Laura, her voice low and furious. "You said Christine wouldn't talk." Laura hissed back. "How was I supposed to know she'd flip? This is your mess, Jessica." Their argument spilled out into the hallway, drawing curious stares from onlookers. I watched them unravel from a distance, their carefully crafted partnership dissolving into a mess of blame and desperation. James turned to me, his voice low. "They're done. Tomorrow, the court's going to see them for exactly what they are." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and vindication. The game they had played so confidently was over, and tomorrow the final move would be mine. The courtroom buzzed with tension the next day as everyone filed in for the final ruling. Jessica's usual confidence was gone, replaced by a pale, hollowed-out version of the woman who once believed she controlled everything. Laura wasn't even trying to mask her anxiety anymore. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, her sharp eyes darting around the room like she was looking for an escape route. Maxwell sat stiffly beside them, flipping through his notes one last time, though it was clear he knew the fight was over. On my side of the room, James leaned back in his chair, exuding quiet confidence. He glanced at me and gave a subtle nod, as if to say, "This is it." When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Everyone's attention shifted to her as she shuffled her papers, her expression unreadable. She cleared her throat and began, her tone steady but laced with authority. "After careful review of the evidence submitted, including financial records, sworn statements, and recorded footage, it is clear that this case involves more than just the dissolution of a marriage. The actions of Mrs. Gray and Ms. Carter demonstrate a deliberate effort to defraud and manipulate this court." Jessica's shoulders stiffened, and I caught the slight shake of her head as she whispered something to Laura. But the judge wasn't done. "The financial misconduct, paired with the fabrication of abuse allegations, is not only unethical but criminal in nature. As such, I am referring this case for further investigation by the appropriate authorities." The air was sucked out of the room. Laura's eyes widened in horror, and Jessica's mouth dropped open as she muttered, "This can't be happening." The judge continued, undeterred. "As for the division of marital assets, I find in favor of Mr. Gray. The financial evidence clearly shows an attempt to conceal and misappropriate funds. Therefore, I am awarding him full control of all joint assets, including the marital home and associated accounts. Additionally, Mrs. Gray will be required to pay restitution for the funds transferred to Ms. Carter's LLC. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but the sound barely registered over the roar of satisfaction building in my chest. Jessica looked as though the floor had dropped out from under her. Laura slumped in her seat, her face pale and slack. Maxwell stood, his voice desperate. "Your Honor, surely we can appeal." "You may file for appeal," the judge cut in sharply. "But given the overwhelming evidence, I doubt you'll find much success. This ruling is final." The gavel came down and it was over, just like that. As the room emptied, Jessica spun around, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think this is over, Eric?" she spat, her voice shaking. "You've ruined me." I met her gaze, my own calm and steady. "No, Jessica. You ruined yourself." Laura grabbed Jessica's arm, trying to pull her away, but she shook her off. "You're going to pay for this," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, but you haven't seen the last of me." I didn't flinch. I didn't need to respond. The look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She was broken, her schemes exposed, her control shattered. As I walked out of the courtroom with James by my side, the weight of months of betrayal and manipulation finally lifted. I stepped into the sunlight, breathing deeply, feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Freedom. Jessica and Laura had tried to destroy me, to take everything I had worked for. But in the end, their greed and arrogance had been their undoing. They thought they could play me, but they didn't realize I had stopped playing their game long ago. Justice wasn't just served, it was served cold. And it tasted damn good. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, the sunlight bright against the stone steps. For the first time in what felt like forever, I stood tall, a calm resolve settling over me. Justice had been served, and the chaos Jessica and Laura had unleashed was finally behind me. But the echoes of their venom still lingered, a reminder that some battles leave scars no matter how decisively they're won. I hadn't made it far down the steps when I heard her voice, sharp and cutting, slicing through the crowd like a blade. "Eric!" Jessica called, storming toward me, Laura trailing behind with a scowl. I stopped and turned, watching her approach, her face a mix of desperation and fury. She looked disheveled, her perfect composure shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You think this is some kind of victory?" "It's not a victory," I said calmly, my voice steady. "It's the truth. Something you and your sister wouldn't recognize if it hit you in the face." Laura snorted, her bitterness evident. "Don't act so smug. You got lucky." I turned to her, my gaze unwavering. "Lucky? No, Laura. What happened in there was the result of your lies catching up with you. You two built your plan on deceit and greed, and it crumbled under its own weight." Jessica stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this, Eric. You've humiliated me, destroyed my life." "Destroyed your life?" I interrupted, my tone sharp. "You destroyed your own life when you decided to betray the person who trusted you most. You don't get to play the victim anymore, Jessica. That mask doesn't work now." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked truly lost, like she didn't know what to do without her lies to shield her. Laura sneered. "This isn't over. People like you. People like me?" I cut in, my voice rising just enough to silence her. "Let me tell you something about people like me, Laura. We learn. We adapt. And when someone tries to destroy us, we don't just survive, we come back stronger." I let the words hang in the air, watching as their expressions shifted from anger to unease. They had nothing left, no schemes, no leverage, no control. They were finally powerless, and they knew it. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving them behind on the courthouse steps. Their voices faded into the background as I moved forward, each step feeling lighter than the last. Later that evening, as I sat in my now quiet house, I reflected on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the schemes. It had all tested me in ways I never thought possible. But I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and freer than I'd ever been. Jessica and Laura had underestimated me. They thought I was just another obstacle to bulldoze over. But they were wrong. I wasn't their victim, I was their reckoning. And as I stared out at the setting sun, I smiled, knowing one simple truth. They'd never see me coming if they ever tried again. Because I wasn't just rebuilding my life, I was rebuilding it on my terms. And nothing, not Jessica, not Laura, and not anyone else would ever take that from me again.